slightly behind time, so we'll get moving again. It's a real honour to welcome Pedro Conceição here to Dublin and to the Royal Irish Academy. So his UN career is hard to kind of sum up. But since January 2019, Pedro has been director of the UN's Human Development Report Office, and he's been lead author of the UN's annual Human Development Report. Before that, Pedro served as Director of Strategic Policy at the Bureau for Policy and Programme Support, and previous to that again, as Chief Economist and Head of the Strategic Advisory Unit at the Regional Bureau for Africa. And Pedro started his career at the UN as Director of the UNDP's Office of Development Studies. Prior to joining the UN, Pedro also had another career as a teacher, as an assistant professor at the Technical University of Lisbon, where his research and teaching addressed how science, technology and innovation policy overlap in multiple ways in our contemporary world. His first degree was in physics from the Technical University of Lisbon, but his intellectual galaxy could not be contained to just one discipline, and he gained a PhD in public policy from the Lyndon Baines Johnson School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas at Austin, where he was also a Fulbright scholar. Pedro's work on public financing for development has been published by Oxford University Press in 2 co-edited books, The New Public Finance from 2006 and Providing Global Public Goods, Managing Globalization in 2003. He's also published on inequality, development and technological change, and the economics of innovation in leading journals in development studies, development economics, and social policy. And more widely, and reflecting his vision for more holistically understood concerns of security and interventionism, and many of the themes we're engaging here today, he has written very important pieces on key development questions of inclusivity, knowledge production, and social cohesion. The final thing I'll say is he's had such wonderful grace, despite the fact that he's had 48 hours more or less without sleep. He's traveled all the way from New York with multiple flight delays on the way, and it's testament to your character, Pedro, that you've warmly barely mentioned that. But his plenary talk today is probably appropriate to your travel experience: uncertain times, unsettled lives, human development in a world of worry. Pedro, welcome.
Thank you, John. That was very kind. It's a real pleasure for me to be here. I already learned a lot, and it was worthwhile all the sacrifices of the disruptions associated with travel. But I mentioned, John, that I had a particular reason to be here as well. I didn't disclose what it was, but I will do it now. And that was that my daughter decided to come to college, to Trinity College Dublin. When I told her that I had been invited to come here for the first time ever in 17 years, she showed some pride in what I do. Some mild amount of pride, but at least some pride. So I couldn't miss it. I had to move mountains to be here with all of you. So what I wanted to do very briefly is to give an account of some of the work that we've been doing in our Human Development Report Office in 2019. And you will see how we have landed in a context or in trying to understand the context of uncertainty that you alluded to, John. But that's not actually how we started in 2019. And this has been a series or a sequence of human development reports interspread by the special report on human security as well. We started by trying to understand the difference between a steady improvement in many indicators of human development over the last 30 years or so, or in the 30 years up to 2019 at least, and the persistence in gaps in human development as well, And I think I should probably mention what is human development, because sometimes human development is associated only with Human Development Index, and this is an important metric, and I'll come to it in a little bit. But the idea of human development is much simpler than that. The idea of human development is basically that people should be able to live lives to their full potential, which is a very, very simple and basic idea. But it's an idea that takes us to two important notions or pillars of this human development approach. One is that it's important to look at criteria for assessing progress or evaluating policies that takes us beyond just looking at income or means, other means that enable people to live lives to their full potential. And we've already heard, for instance, the increasing importance of health in the previous session. So this is the first pillar, the broader understanding of well-being. And the second important pillar is the importance of agency, human agency, seeing in people as agents, not patients, to use the phrase of Amartya Sen. And this is something that Lorraine has already alluded to quite a lot in our first session. So in the 2019 Human Development Report, our main motivating question was to try to understand this gap between improvements in average achievements and inequalities in human development. And what we found in that report was that there was a difference when we looked at inequalities between some that were shrinking, so some inequalities in human development were actually narrowing, and some inequalities in human development were widening. So what inequalities were shrinking? Inequalities in those aspects of human development that we classified as basic capabilities. So if we look at indicators like extreme poverty, or child mortality, or enrollment rates in primary education, these are all metrics that are used to gauge success of development. All of these were actually getting better. And that's why if we look at a chart looking at the evolution of Global Human Development Index that we started to compute in 1990, the Human Development Index is an indicator, a metric that brings together standards of living along with achievements in health and education. You see basically a line of steady improvement. Because of the choice of the indicators and the dimensions of human development that are included in the index, that speak to these very basic elements of human development. So success, progress, things were getting better. But inequalities were widening in other aspects of human development. Aspects that we classified or described as enhanced capabilities. So these are things like life expectancy at older ages, not only child mortality, which is one of the key determinants of life expectancy at birth. Enrollment rates in higher levels of education, quality of education. So when we look at this aspect, we saw that gaps were actually widening. And at the time, also 2019, some of you may remember, it was a period where we had a number of protests and demonstrations around the world, in Chile, in Colombia, in Ecuador, in Lebanon, in parts of Asia. And our interpretation at the time was that even where income inequalities, because a lot of the discussion around inequalities is centered around income and wealth inequalities, and these are important. But some of the places in which we're seeing these demonstrations, these uprisings in some contexts, were countries where income inequalities are actually been narrowing. So this again speaks to the improvement in inequalities associated with some basic aspects. But given that inequalities in the enhanced capabilities were widening, we interpreted these demonstrations as this protest as a demonstration of some sense of alienation by many people, particularly young people, from perceiving themselves as being able to seize on the opportunities of the 21st century, for which these enhanced capabilities were more and more important. So this was sort of the story of the 2019 Human Development Report that was focused on this notion of inequality. But that could not be the whole story. And that's what took us to exploring the notion or understanding what's happening when it came to insecurity. So inequality, but also insecurity. And to do so, we went back to the notion of human security, which Jerry described very well, how it emerged. It emerged in the context in which there was a need for a narrative that would convince people to reallocate resources away from military security or territorial security towards something that would enhance human development. So human security is defined in the 1994 Human Development Report as something that enables people to be free from fear, free from want, and free from living in indignity. Now, this is language that comes directly from the preamble of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So it seeks to add dimensions to territorial security by putting a focus on people. And it also is a way of bringing together the pillars of the United Nations Charter, human rights, peace, and development. So it fulfilled its role, it had its evolution, the discourse, we already heard about how it has evolved, but in the sessions earlier today, but we felt that it was important to look at that notion of human security in light of a context where we're seeing this unsettledness as reflected not only in these demonstrations, but in many other things. So that led us to the special report on human security, and the findings were striking and surprising. We've already heard a key headline finding that 6 out of every 7 people around the world felt insecure about some aspect of their lives. 6 out of every 7 people around the world. Research that we did after the report came out showed that 50% of the population today in the world, half of the population today, does not believe that their living standards are better than the generation of their parents. So there is something here about the way in which people perceive the world, the context in which they live, and also the prospects of what's likely to happen, in a light that is not fully reflected in these some standard indicators of well-being that we tend to consider, including the Human Development Index. Now, since the report came out in a special report on human security, we've had 2 years in which, along with these indicators of perceptions of human security, we had for the first time ever a decline in the Global Human Development Index 2 years in a row. Moreover, it was not only a decline in the average Human Development Index, but it was a decline that was widespread across countries. Typically, every year, when we publish our reports, you always have a few countries that suffer a decline in the Human Development Index. Countries suffer in terms of trade shocks or a major disaster. But at most, we had historically 20% of countries suffering a decline in the Human Development Index. This happened during the global financial and economic crisis around 2008, 2009. But in 2020 and in 2021, we had 90% of countries witnessing a decline in the Human Development Index. So this is an unprecedented shock that is reflected not only in these measures or perceptions of insecurity, but also in the objective measures of well-being. So why? What was going on here? And that was the question that we explored in our last Human Development Report that John alluded to, which is called Uncertain Times, Unsettled Lives. And our hypothesis or account as the reasons why we're facing this context is to suggest that the context in which we live today is characterized by novel forms of uncertainty. So uncertain times that are uncertain in new ways. Not necessarily times that are more uncertain than other periods in the past. I think it would be very hard to establish that. But novel dimensions of uncertainty. And in particular, we identified 3 new layers of uncertainty. The first has to do with what John has already described very well, this new context of the Anthropocene. This is something fundamental, new and unprecedented in both human history and in the geological timescale of the planet. So much so that many geologists and Earth system science are proposing that we should be describing our current time as a new geological epoch. Geologists are in the process of voting and making a decision on whether this will be officially determined or not. But I believe, and many others do, that the data is unmistakable, that the planet, our planet, is changing in very fundamental ways. It's not only climate change, which, as rightly so, a lot of salience, but it's biodiversity loss that's manifested in part in the increase in the frequency of new or re-emerging zoonotic diseases, which are associated with these planetary pressures. By the way, I'll just give you a number to give you the scale of the extent to which we are, as humans, altering our planet. The weight, if you were to weigh all the dogs that exist in the world today as pets, they would be equivalent, the mass, the weight of these dogs, to all the wild mammals that exist on the planet today. So we as humans are changing the climate, are shaping evolution of animals, of plants to serve human consumption in ways that will have implications for hundreds of thousands or even millions of years. And this is making for a more dangerous planet. Not for everybody equally, so there's a deep connection here to inequalities, so the topic of the 2019 Human Development Report. Inequalities both in those that contribute to these planetary pressures and those suffering the consequences. So this dynamic of a planet that is changing very rapidly and how it connects to inequalities was the topic of our 2020 Human Development Report, in which we also propose, as John alluded to, a new metric in which we adjust Human Development Index by the extent to which different countries contribute to these planetary pressures. And in the report, actually, we also provide evidence of how we can distribute the impact of these planetary pressures across the income distribution. So not only at the level of country, but at the level of individuals. With joint work that we did with our colleagues at the World Inequality Lab. So this is the first layer of uncertainty, the Anthropocene. There's a second layer of uncertainty associated with the context of political polarization. Political polarization is not new, but it's now acquiring new shapes, new forms. And moreover, we were able to establish a link between perceptions of insecurity and many aspects that are important for this dynamic of polarization. For instance, this comes actually from the literature and from theory and some empirical evidence that suggests that the more insecure people feel, the more attracted they are to support authoritarian leaders. The more insecure people feel, the more likely they are to support political positions at the extreme of the political spectrum, both on the left and on the right. The more insecure people feel, the less likely they are to say that they trust others. So with these increases in perceptions of insecurity, it's no surprise that we see these patterns of polarization and that we currently have the lowest level of trust on record of generalized trust. Less than 1 in 3 people report trusting a person that is not part necessarily of their immediate social circle. So in this context, it's not surprising that sometimes it's so difficult for societies and also the international community when it comes to countries to come together in addressing shared challenges. We have evidence that many democratic norms and practices in many parts of the world are eroding, and in the limit, this takes the form of violent conflict. In the special report on human security, we provided estimates that even before the war in Ukraine, already 1.2 billion people around the world were being affected by violent conflict around the world. Not necessarily living in places where conflict was taking place, but being affected by the many spillovers associated with violent conflict. Forced displacement, volatility in food and energy prices, and many other aspects. So this is the second layer of uncertainty. And the third has to do with the effort that we all are pursuing, or almost all, or many are pursuing, to change our economies, our societies towards what we can call sustainability. So moving away from relying on fossil fuels for energy, seizing on the opportunities of the digital transformation, which is something that provides for a context or that provides for opportunities, but also a lot of dislocation, economic and social dislocation. So it's the interaction of these 3 layers, we argue in our latest report, that provides for a novel context of uncertainty. We called it the new uncertainty complex. But there was an expression that caught on more, which is polycrisis, which I think reflects, in a sense, the same idea. So what to do? The report, our latest report, suggests that it's important to see in a context of uncertainty, of change, also the possibility of doing different things. And the period of the COVID-19 pandemic, which we are still living through, already provided some examples of things that were thought unprecedented that ended up happening, be it the development of new vaccines. I remember when the pandemic was declared, reading in the news, it stuck in me, that a new vaccine on average takes 15 years to be approved. So that was very scary when the pandemic was just declared. And yet, in less than a year, we had multiple vaccines made available. Of course, access was very unequally, which is a moral trauma on all of us. But it was possible to come up with these vaccines in a much faster timeline that was thought possible or conceivable. We saw what central banks and governments around the world really did to sustain economies and firms during the periods of lockdown. And we saw how our norms, social norms, behavior change with the practice of using masks and social distancing and many other behaviors that change in a very rapid or short amount of time. Now, it's very hard for people to see in a context of uncertainty and change possibilities if they feel insecure, and that comes back to these perceptions of insecurity. So we argue that it's important to act on at least 2 dimensions. One, more in the traditional realm of policies or institutions, and we argued for the importance of what we call the 3 I's, investment in people primarily, insurance, both market insurance and social insurance. There was already a reference by Lorraine earlier today about the importance of social insurance, and innovation, so that technology is used to augment what people can do as opposed to being something that we use to replace people. This is something that is now even more salient today with all the discussions around artificial intelligence. and how is creating concerns that it can replace many of the things that humans do. Yes, but it can also be used to augment what people can do. So innovation to harness technology to augment what people can do, but also innovation in other aspects like social innovations or institutional innovations. So these are the 3 I's. And the second set of ideas that we put forward goes back to this notion of social norms, how to change social norms, how to change what we value in society, and understanding that the social context shapes a lot of the things that we believe in and a lot of the things that we think are important. So we can also find ways of intervening to shape the social context in a way that leads people to feel more hopeful about the future and harness this context of uncertainty in a way that is positive and not something that generates fear in them. So I'll stop here. I just want to conclude by saying that we also argue that one of the ways in which we can advance both the 3 I's and this other aspect of changing the broader social context is by doubling down on human development, on the idea of human development. Remember that at the very beginning I mentioned that human development was about this broader understanding of well-being, but also the importance of understanding humans, people as agents, so the importance of agency. And we argue that if we do so, that is something that is not only intrinsically important, but also something that can help us to be better prepared to navigate the uncertain times that we are confronting. Thank you.
Thank you, Pedro. That was just a brilliant overview of our uncertain times and the various dimensions that you've identified have been really helpful for us to think through. I'm sure there are loads of questions and we have a good bit of time, thankfully, that we've regained before lunch. So, Jerry, I think is...
Hi, Pedro. I just wonder if you could say anything about how within the body that's drafting the UN development report, and when you were looking at these notions of risk, did you say anything about capitalism? I mean, if one's imagining, there's a kind of almost an ironic use of the word security in the extent to which the securities market has colonized private pension plans, state pension plans, so that in a sense, people who had a sort of social contract which looked a little bit like a welfare system, which they felt of as a security. I mean, all the studies on what the NHS meant to people, the National Health Service in the UK meant to people, was that they felt secure, that they felt that when they get older, they would not be relying upon their children to look after their teeth for them and so on and so forth. And there has been a concerted attack on state welfare systems in country after country after country, in the rich countries in the name of neoliberalism, and in the poor countries in the name of structural adjustment programs. And it relates then to one of your 3 I's. Your insurance elides 2 sides of that, private and social insurance. But I could imagine a UN development report which wasn't afraid to describe the dynamics of capitalism. It wasn't in hoc to US consent, and could actually describe the dynamics of capitalism and make a case for a welfare state, and make a case. And this is again a peace dividend that was lost: the opportunity to think about what could be learned from socialist systems and incorporated into capitalist systems, rather than a one-winner-takes-all result in the global economy. So is there any discussion within your organization about capitalism as a system?
Thanks, Jerry. I think there are 2 important questions that you're posing. On the first, on capitalism, this was actually something that we looked at in the 2019 Human Development Report around inequalities. So what we have seen over decades, actually, is that the share of income that goes to capital and labor has remained fairly stable in most parts of the world until, let's say, the 1980s. This was a surprise because the power, the force of capitalism is such that, as Marx and many others argue, it would just overwhelm labor. Keynes himself, writing in the late 1940s, I believe, or mid-1940s, at the time there was already evidence that this ratio was very stable, and Keynes said it's a miracle. How did this happen? It happened, and this relates to your second question, because institutions were created, designed, invented to keep this ratio stable. Institutions like trade unions, for instance. Institutions like competition law, and many others. What we have seen more recently is that the share of income going to capital has increased. This is unprecedented historical development. We're seeing that the profit of firms is increased. Markups are increasing. The evidence across the world is a bit patchy, but certainly is the case for the United States and many other high-income economies. So you could say, well, this is the tech sector. It's not only the tech sector. It's something that is happening across all sectors, with more intensity in those that are higher users of technology, yes. So technology here plays a role. So one way of describing what's happening more recently in contrast with what happened before is that a set of institutions that were designed, implemented, put in place to balance capital and labor are or have been eroded either as a result of deliberate choices or because the structure of the economies and technology are changing, or a combination of both. And one of the key institutions that was created over the course of the 20th century was social insurance. Social insurance today in high-income countries accounts for as much as 25% of the economy. 25% of GDP today, on average, in high-income countries is accounted for all sorts of social insurance mechanisms. At the beginning of the 20th century, it was zero, or essentially zero. So this is another example of an institution that is crucial. In fact, the economist Paul Krugman, I don't know if you know him, describes the US federal government as an insurance company with an army. Because if you look at what the US federal government spends, it spends on many things, but the big items are social insurance and defense. If you look at what's happening in low and middle income countries, the percentage of income that goes to social insurance is 5%. So you see the huge gap that it is. So I mentioned that already in many high-income countries, people are feeling insecure, and the sense of insecurity is increasing even in those countries. Partially, maybe because these mechanisms of social insurance are also under attack or stress. But imagine how people feel in low and middle income countries where these mechanisms are under-resourced, not developed, and people have to rely to protect one another from an uncertain world on the same mechanisms that all humanity did at the beginning of the century, these informal mechanisms of risk sharing. And so this is on the social insurance side. Now let's go to the market insurance side, because insurance markets are also very important in our economies. In high-income countries, if there's a loss, an economic loss of something that is insured, on average, if you aggregate everything, 50% of losses are insured in markets. If you go to low and middle-income countries, again, at best, 5% of losses. So both on the social insurance side and on the market insurance side, there's a huge gap here that was already something of concern in a context of sort of not novel uncertainty, but it's even more important if the argument that we put forward about us living in a novel context of uncertainty, it's even more important in that new context. Thank you.
Thanks, Pedro. Yeah, do we have further questions? Just while people are... Oh, there's Una, yeah. Two down here, great.
Thank you very much. Really, really interesting talk. And I really appreciate what you said about social insurance. And I just want to link the indicators with, we talk a lot about the SDGs and the goals, and it's often referred to very broadly, you know, SDG 6, SDG 5, but we talk less really about the SDG indicators. And I don't know how many there are, 300 and something, or no, 240 or 250 indicators, 169 targets. And I know there is one indicator on social insurance, I think it's 1.3. But I'm just wondering about the link between the Human Development Report indicators and the SDG indicators. And I know that, you know, there's tiers of indicators and some are available or some are not. And the reason I ask this is because at the start of your talk, you mentioned, you know, education has improved, some dimensions of indicators have improved. And I'm wondering, do we still value what we measure, you know, if you know what I mean? So that by focusing on certain indicators, does that encourage national statistics offices to start collecting this data, which might encourage more to be done on it, you know, so that countries can look well relatively to their peer countries? Thank you. I'll pass over to...
Yeah, we can take the second question before,
Michael Doyle, a former EU official working inter alia on international crisis response. Pedro, you spoke towards the end about value systems and earlier on about erosion of trust. If we accept that the breakdown in value systems has been a major contributor to development problems and is one of the huge challenges to overcome, I wonder if you think that the Human Development Report could find ways to incorporate some assessment of value systems with appropriate indicators and or in findings to place value on value systems so as to encourage the debate on that, because I find it something that's often absent, is that debate on value systems and the role they play. And I'm thinking of the loss of sense of community in so many countries as well. Thank you.
Shall I? Well, very, very good questions, and I'll try to be a bit briefer than I was before. So I think there are two important questions on indicators. One is the relationship, if I understood correctly, between the SDGs and Human Development Index and some of our indicators. So the SDGs are important, but they establish objectives, goals, aspirations. So we want to reach a certain target by 2030 on a certain dimension. Human development is open-ended. We don't have a target for the Human Development Index. And we also did not set a limit for this Planetary Pressures Index. These are instruments, mechanisms that enable us to assess progress even beyond 2030 and assess the extent to which we are moving in the right direction or not. So we saw decline in the Human Development Index 2 years in a row. Last week, the SDG report, progress report came out, and it reported that we're on track to achieve only 12% of the SDG targets. So it's something that we can use. They are not substitutes, in my view. They are things that complement one another. And I would go, maybe a bit self-serving, but I would go as far as saying that what the SDGs did, in a way, is a political manifestation of the human development approach, which is the idea that human development is multidimensional, that people care about many things at the same time, Sometimes they seem contradictory, as the SDGs are, or in tension with one another. Some of the targets are in tension with one another. And that's fine, because that's how people are, how societies are. And that's why the Human Development Index put together things that were very disparate. And we've since then added other indices. So I see the SDGs and our own metrics of human development as complements and not substitutes. And yes, they do encourage national statistical offices to do a better job at providing information about the situation in the country. I'll give you a specific example. By the way, as an aside, almost every week I receive letters in my office complaining by one country or another about the index or an indicator, and that's good. I welcome that, because that's what we want. You want people to pay attention. But the example was a country in Africa, which shall remain unnamed, that was saying that the indicator we were using for the education component on the HDI was too low and didn't reflect the reality of the country. And we take these complaints very seriously, because authorities know. And if it's something that they are really uncomfortable, we should look into it. So a team went to this country, and what did they find? They found that education in this government was organized or divided in 3 different ministries: primary, secondary, and tertiary. So there were 3 ministers and 3 ministries. Only the education ministry was providing information to UNESCO on enrollment rates. The other 2 were not providing. So they were using, or we were using, because that was the information available, enrollment rates as if there were only children enrolled in primary education, because there was not information from the other countries. So this was corrected. And there are many examples of things like this as to how just having an index or these indices people pay attention to and contribute also to the improvement of statistical information. On the assessment of value systems, this is something that we've started looking into already in the 2020 Human Development Report, but more in detail or more extensively in our latest Human Development Report, is to try to understand. I think, let me backtrack a bit. I think it's very hard to understand some of the patterns that we see, particularly when it comes to political polarization, by using a lens that is framed only by self-interest and rational choice models. Many people display behaviors that go objectively against their self-interest. So something else is motivating them to undertake these behaviors. Part of it is beliefs, a set of beliefs. For instance, we saw that during the period of COVID-19, attitudes towards vaccines often were, or using masks for that matter, were associated less with a rational decision on whether to take a certain risk or not, which is something that you could accept. Or even concerns about autonomy, which you could also understand and accept. But they were primarily driven by affiliation with a certain group. And a certain set of behaviors became associated with the values and identity with certain groups. That it became performative, not wearing a mask or not being vaccinated, as a signal that you belong to a certain group that shared a similar set of beliefs. You see it also when it comes to climate change, for instance, believing or not believing in climate change. So this is just to signal that, yes, this is something that we are looking into and trying to understand why people come to have this such separate set of beliefs, and why is it so difficult for people to find ways of finding, not necessarily agreeing, because diversity of opinions and views is healthy in society, diversity is important, but finding ways of communicating and engaging with one another. In the social psychology, there is this literature, there's this distinction between bridging and binding. So these are very powerful processes, social processes. So people are bound by people that share a similar set of beliefs, but we also need mechanisms to bridge these different set of beliefs. And that's what the institutions that we have, our political institutions, social institutions, are meant to do. Well, they are frailing. They are not doing this very well in many cases, and we have to understand why. And to do so, one does not do that by demonizing the other group, but by recognizing that they came to hold the beliefs they do in ways that mirrors the same psychological and social processes that the other group does. So if we have this approach, which is an argument that we also try to develop in our special report on human security, there might be a possibility to find interventions that can mitigate some of the challenges that we confront in groups coming together. For instance, one of the things that is very well documented is that these groups hold very misguided perceptions about what the other group thinks of the group they belong to. In other words, if I belong to a group and John belongs to another, I think that John really thinks very badly of us, of my group. But actually, the actual belief is not as bad as the one I have. So these misperceptions are widespread in society. So this speaks to the possibility of using interventions associated simply with providing information about factual beliefs as opposed to perceived beliefs or second-order beliefs as ways of doing this bridging. Because I think it's, and I'll conclude with this, I think these are the ways in which societies can find mechanisms that lead them to evolve in the direction of having value systems that are more conducive to expanding human development, which is normatively what we care about and what we advocate for in our reports, but also towards navigating this new context of the Anthropocene or making progress towards sustainability. Thank you.
Yeah, time for one more question, yeah, sure.
Hi, thank you so much for such an interesting presentation. My name is Claire, and I thought that the three parts that you laid out that were novel threats to the Anthropocene, political polarization, and then the third on the effort of changing our economies, very interesting. But in terms of this question of human development, I have a sort of a broad thought that. We are saying that we are developed if we have education, if we're not living in poverty. And yet, to me, the notion of being a developed nation, a developed world, is that you're not living outside your planetary boundaries. So I wonder if, in as you said, 1,000 years to come, if they look back at this age and realize that we were the ones that were undeveloped because our ancestors were actually living within that planetary boundaries. And something I read recently was that this word poverty only came into common use in the English language in the 1500s onwards, when private property came into being and enclosure happened, and what we would now classify as a mass internal refugee crisis across Europe, where people were forced off their lands, forced off the shared common lands, had to go into cities. Prostitution came about for the first time, poverty came about for the first time, child mortality in huge numbers because of the issues of living in closed quarters without sanitation came into being. And then you also have this issue then of people willing to move to new nations for opportunities because of the crowdedness and the dirtiness of living in Europe. That was it more than a religious, or obviously religious freedom came into it as well. So I just think, that quote from, I don't know if I should quote Churchill here, but the further back you look into history, the further forward you can see into the future. So, it is sort of interesting not just to learn from the global south, but what our ancestors in Europe were doing, and the the insecurity that our ancestors felt having to move into cities. And back to the point again about disconnection. Sort of the second point I would say is, this issue of insecurity when you don't trust others. It's very difficult in cities to trust others. I come from the countryside. It's very different in a city where you don't have your connections, you don't have your people, you don't have a sense of belonging. And all the studies say that, I think, is that 80% of the population in the next 50 years will live in cities across the world. So that again is going to lead to more insecurities unless we reform that connection to each other. And then a final point as a mother, I found it really sad to read that for in terms of education, more children can name branded logos like McDonald's and Netflix, but can't name plants or flowers. So what is it that we're actually teaching them? What is it that we're valuing? Or what is it that they are realizing that we value? So we really have sort of lost that connection to nature, which explains as well this insecurity with the Anthropocene. So yeah, a lot of comments there.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Wow, that's fascinating. We could be discussing for hours, so let me just try to be brief. And let me start with the point you made, which I think is so right, about the importance of learning from history. And in the reports, if you take a look at them, you'll see that I've been trying to bring contributions from historians, including historians that look into deep history. And it's not easy. Sometimes my team reacts a little bit and say, well, it's about developments, the future. But particularly in a context of uncertainty, I think it's so important to learn from history. And one of the things that surprised me, because it went against what I thought, was this discussion around ecocide or ecological collapse, with accounts of what happened in Easter Island, that would be a metaphor for the context that we're living through. But actually, in the context of planetary boundaries, what historians tell us is that these narratives of collapse, let me put it in quotation marks, are overrepresented in popular discourse and policy discourse. For the most part, human societies were able to cope with environmental change and thrive as a result of that, using multiple strategies. And this is something that we've been trying to give more salience to in our reports, because particularly in a context where people feel insecure, narratives of boundaries and limits can be even more constraining, as opposed to, again, emphasizing human agency and the possibility, not the prediction. I wouldn't know what I would predict, but the possibility of humans changing their values and doing things differently. And on the narrower point about the challenges of people living in cities, if you want to simplify, or settlements, you're absolutely right. In fact, James C. Scott argues that the reason why these early civilizations had walls was not to protect against attack, was to keep people inside, because people wanted to leave the cities, because life was much better outside of the cities. And even when these narratives of collapse, civilization collapse, are described, much of the population after the collapse was actually better off, because they dispersed and they found these multiple ways of thriving. So I think you're right, and this is something that is important for us to learn and to have a richer understanding of the possibilities that are in front of us. On trust, so what we know from much evidence and theory is that trust is a concept that depends on the social circle, which I think was what you were alluding to, right? So almost any person would tend to trust someone from their family, then someone in their country, then someone that shares the same religion, then a stranger. So the trust I refer to is, if you want, trust in a stranger, what's called generalized trust or interpersonal trust. So there is if you want to plot trust along a social circle, there's sort of a gradient, right? The larger the social circle, the lower the trust. So this is a fairly general trend. But in our report, what you will see is that this gradient is much steeper for people that feel insecure. And that's what accounts for the lowest level of trust that I mentioned to is this interpersonal trust, generalized trust. Less than 1 in 3 people trust a stranger, if you want to use that expression today. And on your last point, and there was a reference before to the Dasgupta review, and in the end, that's what the Dasgupta review boils down to, is this idea that and it's about changing values, once again, that's his call. He even uses an expression of rekindling a love for nature. You know, this is a report on the economics of biodiversity, but that's where he lands, again speaking to the importance of reconnecting with nature, understanding our interdependence with nature, and how detached we have become. So fully agree with you.
Thanks, Pedro. I'll just finish there just to say thanks to the audience for some really great questions, extending the kinds of critiques that, for me as an academic, it's heartening to know that you're reflecting on all of these concerns that we're raising, because it seems to me that your probably biggest challenge is disseminating that critique within not just the UN, but upwards and outwards as well, because it's one thing to have a vision for, you know, a broader understanding of well-being and the import of agency, but getting that heard and getting that activated anew in ways which are more supportive and so on. And also self-critically being aware of that great question at the end of how development is defined. So it's heartening. So I'm going to retain that positivity to finish and say thanks again to Pedro for coming from New York today. It really was a pleasure, and it was fascinating to hear your perspective. So thanks, Pedro.
Thank you.
And just to say as well that we have lunch outside. We're going to break from Academy House, I think, and we're back at 2:30. So there's loads of places, I think, around, as Pedro was saying, to hopefully grab lunch. And Pedro will be around all afternoon, so hopefully you'll get a chance to chat more with him then as well.